or 2 minutes. Thank you for joining our webinar today, FDTA, Entity and Security Identifiers. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and we're very happy to have with us today some terrific speakers. I just want to go through a few logistical points before we get started. We are taking questions throughout the program, and so if you have questions for any of our speakers, please use the Q&A link that you see on your Zoom console here to just submit a question, and we'll take them as we go through. I'm going to start by first introducing our moderator, Campbell Pride. Campbell is President and CEO of XBRL US, and he's going to be moderating this session and providing some opening remarks. So Campbell, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. So today we're going to talk about legal entity identifiers, and we've got some great speakers today. We've got Richard Robinson, who is the Chief Strategist of Open Data and Standards from Bloomberg. We also have joining us Peter Worms, who's the Business Development Manager for the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, or more commonly called GLIFE. And finally, we have Scott Price, who's a Senior Vice President and the Global Head of QSIP, FactSet Research Systems, Inc. So we're going to hear from our speakers in a minute, but first I'm just going to give a little bit of background on the FDTA, or the Financial Data Transparency Act. This bill, or this act, actually affects 8 member agencies of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FSOC, which includes the Securities and Exchange Commission. These groups, which is basically being tasked under the FDA regarding the requirements for the FDTA as it applies to municipal securities. And the key thing about this act is its call for the use of data standards, and we're going to talk about one of these. There's a lot of information in this act if you haven't seen it, but one of the things that we're going to talk about today is common identifiers, particularly this quote here, which is common identifiers for the collections of information reported to covered agencies or collected on behalf of the council, being the FSOC agencies, which shall include a common non-proprietary legal entity identifier that is available under an open license for all entities required to report to covered agencies. So this one sentence basically has had large impact, and that's what we'll focus on today. So just to give everyone a little bit of background just on where we are in terms of the timeline, this is the timeline. In 2022 is when the FDTA was signed into law in December. In 2023, the SEC had to do a report to Congress on the use of XBRL data as part of the FDTA. And 2024 is a big year in terms of the first set of standards coming up for public comment. And this is a joint data standards that will be published for public review. So they should be published in June of this year. And this is going to lay the groundwork for how these standards will be used, and the standards we're talking about today. And then they're expected to adopt the final rules by the end of December. And then in 2025, the rules have to be the agencies like the SEC and different agencies have to look at how they're going to implement the FDTA, and they're going to start working on rules. And then in 2026, We should see from the SEC, for example, their proposed rules on municipal data standards, and they should come out for public exposure. So if you're interested in that area, then 2026 is the year you want to put some time aside to look at these. And then the joint data standards will be effective by December 2026, and then we should have a final rule. And then 2027, the effective date for the municipal markets to adopt these data standards will go into effect. So 3 years away, it seems like there's quite a bit of time, but there's actually quite a bit of work that's going to be going on over the next couple of years. And it's important that people are aware of this and they give feedback where it's appropriate, so that you can make sure that these requirements and the bills and this act is implemented in a way which works for all market participants. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Richard, who is going to talk to us about what he's been doing, what Bloomberg's doing relative to the legal entity identifier and security identifiers. So, Richard, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Campbell. So, relevance to Bloomberg, speaking at this, Bloomberg does operate 2 open data standards on behalf of the industry for public good. Legal entity identifier, which Campbell briefly mentioned, and Peter Worms will probably get more into it than I am, and the financial instrument global identifier. Both are open data. They're global standards through various standards organizations. And let's go to the next slide. So Bloomberg's involvement in LEI is we are a local operating unit, LOU, and we are the largest issuer of LEIs globally out of 37 entities that are out there. Over 400,000 LEIs under management, and we can issue LEIs in over 220 jurisdictions. The thing is that every year you have to get accredited, and I think Peter's going to go into more detail on what the LEI does from benefits aspect as well as LOU and governance operations. So the important thing is Bloomberg supports the LEI globally and has been accredited to issue LEIs for our 6th year, which is a great thing. So next slide. So I want to talk more about FIGI. So FIGI is a financial global identifier. It is based in open data. So just like LEI, which is based on open data charter, FIGI actually incorporates the MIT open source license within the standard itself, which is kind of unique for any standard within financial services. We believe that transparency and interoperability is only solved through open data, especially for these core kind of important commoditized kind of identifiers, which for identifying legal entities and for financial instruments. Some things about FIGI, which is different than previous standards around identifying financial instruments, is FIGI does not change. So much like the LEI, it's permanent. And it allows clear data lineage tracking across multiple sources. And this includes when other identifiers might change corporate actions or reuse. And also, FIGI allows identification of different contexts needed when there's different activities going on in use cases pertaining the same financial instrument. The FIGI standard is a data model in that it includes the descriptive metadata as well as a core identifier that's permanent and identifies that context instrument. And it's self-referencing so that you can aggregate and pull the information together. Over 1.2 billion FIGIs issued as of last year. Speaking to its adoption, we're handling 12 billion API jobs per month on the openfigi.com website service. And that's accessible through a JSON API that doesn't require any registering. Again, it's open data for any kind of use, used globally by all firms, including vendors. So next slide. Just some notable developments. The last thing in the standards activity around FIGI was the adoption by the U.S. National Standard Institute X9. So it's a U.S. national standard in 2022. We also added a certified provider, which is included within the governance framework of the FIGI standard. CAICO joined in 2021. They are accredited through the Object Management Group as per the governance guidelines, and we have over 14,000 pairs and 7,000 cryptocurrencies identified by CAICO as a certified provider. We are a national standard of Brazil through ABNT, and the original accreditation came through Object Management Group, which is an international technology standards consortium. 27 countries, over 250 members. Their standards are key in running military style satellites, telecom, and they're very technology heavy standards organization, which is why we thought the FIGI was an appropriate place to build the standard there, given its a data model and metadata aspects. The only last things I'll point to here is FIGI's alignment with the FDTA in regards to open data principles, and FIGI's inclusion in regulatory both consultations, and just last year for SEC rewrites, FIGI was included in 13F, Form MPF, securities loans, and short selling reporting. So as a voluntary optional identifier to be used alongside CUSIP, which I believe Scott Price is going to speak to about after this. But the important thing I think is to point out that in something like 13F, which FIGI is completely voluntary to include, from day one, over 10% of reporters are including FIGI voluntarily, which speaks to their view as it being easy to include and that they actually use it currently. And it's not an impediment for them to include on their regulatory reporting. So that's about it. We'll let everybody else go through, and then I'm sure we have tons of questions coming in. So.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So now I'm going to hand it over to Peter Worms. He's going to talk a little bit about the GLIFE and give us an introduction to that, and the LEI and the impact of the FDTA. So hand it over to you, Peter. Peter, I think you're on mute.
Yep, sorry. Michelle,
Yep.
could you page forward? Thank you very much. Appreciate that, and sorry about that. So yes, Peter Worms from the Global LEI Foundation. Appreciate XBRL for hosting today's event, and certainly inviting GLIFE to attend the event. GLIFE was established by the Financial Stability Board in June of 2014. The Global Legal Identifier Foundation is tasked to support the implementation of the legal entity identifier, commonly referred to as the LEI. The foundation is backed and overseen by the Regulatory Oversight Committee, which is comprised of 68 regulators, 7 of which are from the US, 23 observers, 4 from the US, representing 50 different countries from around the globe. The GLIFE board has 15 independent directors, and most importantly, as Rich just alluded to in his presentation, part of the key component to the global LEI system are the 38 partner issuing local operating units. And as Rich mentioned in his presentation, these are the issuers that are accredited. They go through a rigorous accreditation process to become local operating units. So it's not as simple as saying, I'm going to raise my hand, I want to issue LEIs. GLIFE makes sure that those that are issuing LEIs can demonstrate the capabilities to verify and validate information across many different jurisdictions. And in the case of Bloomberg, as Rich alluded to, they're accredited in more than 220 different jurisdictions around the globe. And to date, we've got more than 2.5 million LEIs that have been issued. Page forward. So the LEI itself is a 12-character alphanumeric code based on the ISO 17442 standard developed by the International Organization for Standardization. It connects to key reference information that enables clear and unique identification of legal entities participating in financial transactions. Each LEI contains information about an entity's ownership structure, and thus answers the question of who is who and who owns who. The publicly available LEI data utility can be regarded as the global directory, which greatly enhances transparency in the global markets. The LEI also is currently included in more than 280 rules and regulations from around the globe. This includes nearly 50 existing rules from the US, most of which belong to financial regulators led by the SEC, which has also included the LEI on an optional basis, as Rich alluded to, in various forms like Form ADV or as Rich referenced, the Form 13F. In fact, the US was the birthplace of the LEI. Dodd-Frank essentially originated the LEI for derivative reporting to the CFTC some years ago. Page forward, Michelle. Great. In terms of the FDTA, I know Campbell touched on some of this information already, so I'm not going to repeat that first bullet there. But the bill itself calls for legal entity identifiers. It doesn't call specifically for the LEI. So in a lower case, it calls for legal entity identifiers. The criteria for the FDA specifies the following: be fully searchable, machine readable, be non-proprietary or made available under an open license, and incorporate standards developed and maintained by voluntary consensus standards bodies. Right, to take that step further with regards to the open license, in terms of US code, that means a legal guarantee that a data asset is made available at no cost to the public, with no restrictions on copying, publishing, distributing, transmitting, citing, or adapting such an asset. So the LEI meets all of this criteria. So thank you very much, and look forward to the conversation ensuing and the panel discussion.
Okay, thank you, Peter. So I'll hand it over to Scott, and he's going to give us a rundown on CUSIP Global Services and what they're doing to support the FDTA. So I'll hand it over to you, Scott.
Well, thanks very much, Campbell, and thank you, Michelle Savage and XBRL US, for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm Scott Price. I'm Global Head of CUSIP Global Services, which is proudly operated for the American Bankers Association by FactSet Research Systems, Inc. And I'm delighted to be here today. And in reviewing the impressive list of attendees that signed up for today's event, I see a broad mix of disciplines and exposure to the unique world of identification systems. So I'll apologize in advance if I use my agreed upon 3 slides to commingle some key fundamental identification issues with some more detailed developments and trends, and all given from the experienced view of CUSIP Global Services as a national numbering agency and also a standards market practitioner. Next slide, please. So not everyone loves a history lesson, but given some of the themes of today's program, it really pays to quickly revisit some of the drivers that created the CUSIP system. And it really was incompatible identification schemas or a multitude of in-house or proprietary identification systems that gave rise to the development of the 9-character CUSIP and ultimately the release of the first CUSIP database in December of 1968. It was the ABA and some of their member banks that worked for years leading up to that date to develop a system that would be interoperable and machine readable. 2 key provisions that you heard some of my fellow panelists refer to earlier. Those are key provisions for any successful ID system, both then and now. And even today, many data vendors maintain their own internal symbology for specific internal functions. But the utility of those symbologies beyond navigating internal systems is extremely limited. For intercompany, for interinstitution, for cross-market activities, it is the CUSIP in North America and other jurisdictions that drives trusted, effective, and efficient communication in financial markets. It's important to note that the CUSIP standard is also ANSI accredited since 1976, and CUSIP forms the basis of North American 12-character ISINs, and ISINs from 30 plus other jurisdictions for cross-border communications. The ISIN standard, known as ISO 6166, is an ISO standard and has been since 1978. And it's very important to note that the use and adoption of CUSIP predated any mention of CUSIP in specific regulations, not the other way around. It wasn't regulatory compulsion that drove the CUSIP system forward. It was the use and adoption by market participants. So I'll summarize the last 4 bullets on the screen by emphasizing that the fundamental principle of the CUSIP system and many worldwide numbering systems is fungibility. The notion of a single identifier for each fungible instrument. That's the cornerstone of the CUSIP system and the global ISIN system, backed by more than 120 global exchanges, depositories, and numbering agencies, all coming together under the Association of National Numbering Agencies, or ANA. ANA is also the registration authority for the global ISIN standard. In fact, since our panel last met in November, the SEC and the CFTC have issued a joint ruling on Form PF that you heard referenced earlier. That is related to private funds. And the SEC and CFTC in that ruling recognized the vital nature of fungibility. In fact, they wrote, "We agree for reporting on Form PF, a fungible identifier is preferable because it will allow for more consistent reporting of assets than a non-fungible identifier, regardless of the venue of execution, resulting in more effective monitoring and assessment of systemic risk. We are not adopting a change to permit the substitution of FIGI for CUSIP." And in our experience, market participants rely heavily on the one identifier to one fungible instrument principle, and find that generating scores of identifiers predicated on different trading venues for the same fungible security leads to market confusion and ultimately to millions of cumulative non-fungible identifiers flooding the market. Next slide, please. So I want to say loudly, CUSIP Global Services supports the FDTA, and specifically the adoption of a common nomenclature for identifying legal entities. CUSIP Global Services remains extremely proud of our deep involvement in the development and implementation of the LEI. We were active on ISO working groups and the LEI drafting committee, and have worked with local operating units like DTCC and more recently WM Daten in Germany to issue thousands of LEIs as a one-stop shop service, along with the assignment of CUSIP and CUSIP-based ISIN identifiers. However, the FDTA is more than ambitious enough on its own, and in our view, extension to underlying security level identifiers is not part of the statute or original congressional intent. Nonetheless, to the extent that those discussions do take place, CUSIP Global Services would like to be present, contribute its knowledge, so transparency into that process is critical. Last slide, please. CUSIP Global Services and the CUSIP system are always leaning forward, driven by an executive level industry board of trustees that keeps the system anticipating future needs, not merely remaining fit for purpose. This includes active participation in global standards development and expanded industry use of standards developed by numbering agencies, including CUSIP Global Services, such as the Financial Instrument Short Name, the Classification of Financial Instruments Code, or CFI, and most recently, the Unique Product Identifier, or UPI, a global product identifier that complements ISIN codes for OTC derivatives. And finally, extending the coverage of the CUSIP system to emerging asset classes and associated strategic partners is another hallmark of a successful identification system. Today, that translates into CUSIPs for voluntary carbon credits in partnership with the UK-based partner B0 Carbon, private markets across credit and private equity, and in recent years, digital assets, listed options, and physical precious metals. So before I conclude, I do want to take a moment and reflect on one of the later items that Rich flagged in his presentation, the use of FIGI in roughly 10% of 13F filings voluntarily since January of 2023. We have started to see inconsistencies and mapping issues arise in those handful of examples where the FIGI has been used in addition to the required CUSIP in 13F filings. And I only reference these inconsistencies and mapping issues in 13F filings because it's important to note, for the purpose of today's forum, that the primary goal of the FDTA is to create consistency, interoperability, and the seamless flow of information, not to create the need across the industry for cross-reference mapping services. So I look forward to robust questions and panel discussion, and thanks very much for your time.
All right, thank you, Scott. So we have a few questions, and we have some questions are going to come in, and we'll answer those. There's some pre-prepared questions. I'll just go through just quickly. And so, people in the audience, some of them are going to be from the issuer side. They're going to raise funds and they're going to issue debt. And we've heard about the legal entity identifiers and different security identifiers. And for someone issuing debt, these things might seem quite esoteric in many ways. So I suppose the question is, and just to help for those people on the issuing side or those issuers, why are these identifiers so important to the financial markets? Why are both the legal entity identifier important? How should that, how much of that information about my legal structure is important to the capital markets, and why is information that makes it easy to identify my securities important? So maybe Rich, I can kick that one over to you and give your views on that.
Sure. So I'd say today, identifiers are the basis of financial markets, right? You trade something with someone, and at a basic level, you need to know what you're trading and who you're trading with. And actually, from a data person's perspective, my understanding, actually from financial services operations perspective, my understanding, CUSIP was originally created back in the 60s because of the paper crunch. We were all using punch cards, and people were running trades up and down Wall Street in satchels, and they had to shut down the markets on Wednesday to actually settle everything. So you needed to automate things, and the way to automate things is you need an identifier. I don't think we had schemas until 1990s, and interoperability we haven't been talking about until 15.22 came around. So the thing is that identifiers are key towards identifying things and being able to create automation and interoperability. And it sounds simple, but then as markets get more complex, the particular use cases and contexts where it can influence what identifiers you actually need and the metadata underneath that needs to be included in order to properly understand where something is, right? So there's no one contextual representation that fits for everything. Trading, you need ticker. By exchange, settlement, you need more aggregated depository view. I was just at a ZTSI this past week up in Boston, and discussion of PSET still going on, because especially for international depository settlement, it's a key issue for enabling T+1, especially around multi-listed instruments and bond issues that can settle both ICSD or in the US, right? And then if you look at risk, how do you contextualize that? Because for one instrument, say IBM common stock, local country of risk can be an issue, traded country of risk, or the currency risk that you have, depending on where you hold something, versus a fully aggregated view for exposure to a particular entity, which brings in the LEI, right? So being able to tie the entity identification along with the equity that they may have dispersed across the world, and being able to link that all and aggregate that all up. And then you need identifiers for regulators, right? They need transparency into the various processes and to be able to reach and tie these things together properly, but in the proper context, right? Preserving context of flow is really, really hard, especially if you're trying to only use one identifier tied to one specific context. So you're trading transparency, so pricing is going to be vastly different than your position reporting. And you need different data tied to identifiers in order to accomplish that fact. But identifiers are important. So hopefully that answers the initial question about why are identifiers important to financial services? Because you have to trade something with somebody, and depending on the case, that something may be different, and that somebody may be different depending on where in the chain you are in the process.
All right, thank you, Rich. I hand it over to Scott. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Campbell. And yeah, I largely agree with Rich on some of those key points. It's good to hear acronyms like the PSET thrown around. We live in a world of acronyms. I would say the obvious answer, why are they so important? Because identification experts are really big attractions at cocktail parties. When you speak about identifiers at cocktail parties, a swarm of folks get around you to hear what you're saying. But beyond that, when used in conjunction with meaningful data, instrument level identifiers, legal entity identifiers can have tremendous value. In my view, similar to the way effective rules and laws can work. If they're well managed and in the identifier world adopted, they provide a framework and provide order and certainty. Conversely, a list of identifiers without enough meaningful data attached is rather worthless. And a colleague of mine has an analogy that an identifier without appropriate data attached is akin to finding a barcode on the sidewalk. You pick it up, you have no idea if it's related to a TV or a chef's salad. So I think the more important point is, how are these securities identifiers used? And they're used in conjunction with enough meaningful, discrete data points, in the case of CUSIP and ISIN, to guarantee uniqueness of a fungible instrument. And firsthand, with the CUSIP system, for a more complex fixed income instrument, it could take upwards of 60 discrete data points to guarantee uniqueness and fungibility of an asset. And that level of certainty, understanding what instrument, what attributes we're referring to, is critical to so many key market functions. Rich mentioned many of them, trading, clearance, settlement, reconciliation, asset setup and servicing, and security master files, to name a few. But I'll pause there because I'm sure Pete wants to add to this.
Yeah, you guys didn't leave me much to add, but summing it up really from what Rich said and then what Scott continued on is, settlement, trading, clearing, absolutely. And I would say prior to that, there's also origination, right? What I mean by origination is when an instrument is going to be traded for the first time or has to be filed with a regulator for the first time, or is going to a rating agency because it needs a rating because it's a bond and it's going to the marketplace, right? All of those things are critical. From there, it's about workflow as well, right? So when you think about trading systems and portfolio management systems and risk aggregation, the instrument identifiers are passed through various different workflows of both sell side and buy side financial institutions. It's the security identifiers in many ways, or instrument level identifiers in many ways, are the lifeblood of financial data workflow. But they're also used, right, by and large by buy side shops that are buying these securities that have to have a full inventory of what's in the marketplace, right? So they're taking in identifiers even for instruments that they might not invest in, because they want to have a full universe and a full understanding of what is out there, so that when it is priced, when it is bought for the first time, they're taking it from their enterprise data management system because it's something they're already cognizantly aware of, right? So instrument level identifiers, in addition to everything that Scott and Rich said, are critical.
Yeah, and Campbell, I'll just add on, because fungibility has come up a couple times, so that's always a fun topic. So fungibility, well, I don't think you have fungible identifiers. You can have fungible financial instruments that may be identified by identifiers. So that's one little thing. But fungibility can take multiple forms, right? So fungibility in the legal sense of financial instrument, saying equity, is that it's easily substitutable or perfectly substitutable with each other. So the problem is that in financial markets today, especially because of jurisdictional rules and legal things and everything, just from process perspectives, I mean, all the problems that we're seeing or challenges we're seeing from a T+1 implementation, from overseas being able to execute on a T+1 basis, is due to technical friction and workflow friction, which actually impacts technical fungibility. Now, from a theoretical perspective, a lot of things are fungible, but technically and in reality, and being able to buy IBM common stock on the UK LSE one day and the same day sell it in the US, that's just not possible. So that it is fungible. Those two lines are technically fungible, but from a technology and a workforce ability to actually do that process, it's not. So, so some little things in there. That's why it's important to understand the use case that you're operating something in, and have the proper identification and metadata associated with that in order to identify things. Like Pete said, people bring in things that they don't have today, but they use it as comparison against things that they do trade it.
Okay, so that brings up for the next question that we've had. So obviously the identifiers, both legal entity identifiers and security identifiers, are important to the capital markets. So maybe to Scott, what are the characteristics that you believe of a successful identifier for either entities or for securities? Scott, I think you're
making
on.
sure I unmute my mic first. Also, so thank you. I do, if you don't mind indulging me for another 60 seconds before I dive into that. I do want to note, Rich's excellent point that there can be different views of fungibility, both technical and legal. And I think he provided an excellent example, of the same equity trading on two different venues in the same day. I would say, as a standards practitioner and a member of the ANA and ISIN community, again, the fungible ISIN, the single ISIN identifying that equity, can be used in both use cases. And what can change is the use of an ISO standard recognized identifier, like a MIC code, a market identification code, used in conjunction with the fungible identifier. And so, I mean, we can have a very robust conversation about that, but it wouldn't entertain our attendees, but we can certainly take that offline. So circling back to your question, Campbell, about the key elements of, a successful identifier, I would say keeping it simple is really at the top of the list. Making it available to everyone. So I've heard the notion of open thrown around, quite a bit. Open also can be defined in multiple ways. One view of open, is that you need to make the data available to everyone, and that is the case with CUSIP. The CUSIP database is available to all market participants, regardless of their function, on the same terms and conditions as everyone else. We don't have the right to say no to anyone. That's not true of many market data vendors with more robust data sets. So that would be our view of open. The composition of the code itself, in our experience, should be a blending of largely minimal intelligence built into the code, but enough intelligence to give market participants either a visual or a system idea of what we're speaking about. So In the CUSIP world, the first 6 characters identify a unique issuer and only that issuer for life. We have adopted and embraced the ISO principle of permanence, and so legal name changes no longer impact the CUSIP. Another point that was raised earlier. Being rules-based, whether we're talking about corporate actions, a system that's built to accommodate exponential growth, compliance with global standards, all important factors. But before I move on, the fact that the data is sourced from a primary source, or what we would call data provenance, in this age of questionable news sources, probably never more important than ever. Is there a legal prospectus? Is there an official statement backing the existence of this entity, this issuer, this obligor, this instrument? That's something that's been a cornerstone of the CUSIP system since day one. And obviously a commitment to an industry feedback loop for data quality and maintained and operated by subject matter experts. All of that are critical components, in my view, of a successful ID system.
All right, thanks, Scott. Peter, do you have anything to add, maybe specifically for the legal entity identifier?
Yeah, sure. So I think Scott hit some of the basic tenets of what I would refer to as foundational principles for identification. Uniqueness, persistence. It should never be repeated or reused. It should be consistent, right? The format should always be the same. It should always follow the same format. And it should be standardized, right? Which is maintained by voluntary consensus standards bodies. But I will come back to open because I think we'll have varying degrees of or varying definitions with regards to the terminology of open. To me, open means also non-proprietary or made available through an open license. So that would be the only thing I would say that is just a slight bit different from what Scott alluded to.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we'll go to the next question. Sorry, and Rich, do you have anything to add for the characteristics of a successful identifier? I think you covered that at the start. But
no, well, I agree on a lot of the points. Again, I'll echo some of Peter's discussions around open, and people use open to mean many things, but when we're talking about open data and open source, there's particular rights and licenses that exist out there that indicate whether you can reuse, database, redistribute, use things for commercial purposes. So Creative Commons is often referred to license, but there's 4 different kinds of Creative Commons at 4 different levels. So some don't allow commercial use, some do allow for commercial use. And that's why Object Management Group looks at the MIT open source license that's embedded within the FIGI as being one of the optimal ones, because it's very basic, right? You can use it for any purpose you want. Just make sure that you don't force people to pay for it. And if you use it, just credit that it is from the FIGI standard. And the open data charter that Blythe uses is very specific and goes much deeper into the public good and the reason why open is important and the qualities around what actually makes up an open data source. So I would actually look at the open data charter if you want a good definition for what open data actually is.
all right, thank you, Richard. Okay, moving on to the regulators in terms of the benefits of standard identifiers for regulators. So maybe we could talk about some of the current challenges that regulators face today. What are they trying to achieve, and how are these identifiers help them achieve those goals? And maybe things that should be things that regulators aren't doing that they should be doing, and how can the standardization help them there? So Peter, I'll hand that over to you first this time.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is first, let me mention the linchpin paper that was really kind of the genesis of the LEI. And I'm going to come back to describing that in just a second. But the US government uses more than 50 different identifier schemes, right? Some of them are in-house and they serve a variety of different internal purposes, right? The SEC has a CIK number, the OCC has their own number, the NCUA has their own number, the Federal Reserve Bank has the RSSD ID, so on and so forth. And certainly by no means are we saying or suggesting that those should be replaced. That's where the costs come in. We're simply saying that as it applies to the Financial Data Transparency Act, the LEI, if it were to be part of the final rules, should be placed next to that identifier. And then as that broad system of entities that are shared or tracked amongst all of those agencies, you now have actual interoperability, which is what the linchpin paper effectively was designed to create. It most notably was really for the purpose of understanding risk exposure and aggregation, but there was a data management tool component to that paper that enabled data sharing. So I think data sharing is really by and large the spirit, one of the main one of the main components of the Financial Data Transparency Act is that although there might be 50 different identifiers that are used amongst the FSOC agencies today, there should be a rallying cry around one common identifier, at least at the legal entity side, the legal entity front, with regards to data sharing amongst all of the agencies. Campbell, you're on mute, Campbell.
I'm sorry, Scott, do you want to have a crack at this question? So what are some of the benefits to regulators?
Yeah, so I'm going to agree wholeheartedly with my colleague's last comment with regard to the LEI. I view the LEI as one of the remarkable collaborative achievements by our industry. And Peter, thank you for referencing the linchpin document. I haven't heard that in years either. I think one of our industry colleagues, John Bottega, takes partial credit for the production of that excellent paper. And it did set the LEI standard on its upward journey to today, where, as you referenced, there are more than 2.5 million LEIs globally. We're very proud of our part there. We do, take special interest in the use cases for regulators and how symbologies can benefit their functions. And again, use cases for regulators are different from some other market participants that we serve. So this almost commingles in my mind, some of the previous comments about what open is. A lot of that is dictated by use case. There are a plethora of CUSIP users that don't require a license. We're talking about transactional type uses. More than a third of our customers pay no fee, even if they have a license. And we don't do a good enough job, making that well known. In furtherance of the benefits to regulators, I think we also have to guard against misinformation. And again, Campbell, if you can indulge me for a moment, at the outstanding November iteration of this panel discussion, a colleague of mine from Government Affairs and myself had the opportunity to meet some of the audience members after the session. And I don't know if he's participating today, but I want to thank Mark Jaffe from the Cato Institute, who opened our eyes to misinformation. There are, speaking of regulators and benefits of symbology, there were clearly some misinformed viewpoints on the availability of CUSIP codes on MSRB's EMMA system, for example, and what could and could not be used with and without a license. And so, Mark, thank you for bringing that to our attention. And Mark connected us with 2 not-for-profit institutes thereafter. And I'm proud to report that, as we do all the time, academic and research uses of the CUSIP database are open and free. And we continue to promote that, and we should draw greater attention to it. And we would appreciate in the future having that direct dialogue, which it took a little time for us to have with the Cato Institute, and that would reduce some of the misinformation. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Just for time, so Rich, rather than you responding to that, maybe there are some questions that have come in, and maybe so we can respond to those questions. So this is really for you, Rich. That this is a question from Alexandra Cash, Anna, which is International Standards Numbering. I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's basically they're responsible for numbering systems internationally, is working with the GLIFE to ensure a mapping of ISINs, which are security identifiers, global security identifiers with their corresponding legal entities, the legal entity identifiers. So is there any plans for the FIGI to work on a similar mapping where relevant?
So my understanding, I don't stand on the GLIFE's user board from the LOU side of things, but my understanding is that they're having discussions, and that's an ongoing discussion within GLIFE and our LEI service people.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I would add that GLIFE obviously would welcome that. You know, we've got other open mappings in place that are available on GLIFE's website, whether that be to the ISIN that Scott mentioned earlier, also an ISO standard, but also to the BIC, to the BIC and other things like that. So yeah, we would greatly welcome that, and Rich is aware of that, and as is the broader FIGI team.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that goes on is there's the API that anybody can access, including GLIFE. So there's always that road as well, right?
Right. Okay, we had a question from Randy Warshaw, and this is maybe a question for you, Peter. Is how can we ensure that any identifier? So if I'm preparing my my ACFA report and I put my legal entity identifier, when I'm submitting it digitally, is used by the correct party and is actually applied to the actual data being reviewed. So what mechanisms does GLIFE have in place to ensure that that's actually happening correctly?
Yeah, so just like Rich mentioned, we also have an API, right? So anybody that is the recipient of an LEI that wishes to make sure that what they are receiving in terms of an LEI can easily use our API to verify the information that they've received.
Okay.
And if it takes it a step further, because I heard digitally and somewhere embedded in that question, there is a new version of the LEI also, right, in the next chapter, if you will, the LEI, which is the verifiable LEI, which is a digital version or digital credential version of the LEI that GLIFE has used to sign its own annual report, and currently under a pilot with the European Banking Authority and 17 banks that are participating in that pilot that are going to be using the VLAI to sign documents and reports that are filed with the EBA.
Okay.
And Campbell, I don't want to be left out of the love fest.
Jump in.
So CUSIP Global Services obviously has an API as well to distribute data, including the LEI. But I don't want to lose the opportunity just to highlight, the great collaboration between GLIFE and the Association of National Numbering Agencies, and several major numbering agencies, including CUSIP, have now for several years provided an ISIN to LEI link and made that freely available to the market. So again, I think it's one of the great collaborative stories. So Pete, well done at GLIFE, and Anna and some of the NNAs like CUSIP, really leveraging that and making those codes available for free.
Thank you. And we had another question come in from Sally Lowry. I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask the panelists. So is the LEI going to be the same as the SAM.gov LEI?
That sounds like, well, no, I'm not sure what the SAM.gov LEI is, but the LEI itself, the ISO standard 17442, I'm not sure if that is the same. It sounds like Bizarro Superman versus Superman, if you will. But yeah, no, the LEI is, as we alluded to throughout the conversation today, is an ISO standard. It stands alone. SAM.gov, I believe, historically has used DUNS numbers and has created their own identifier known as the Unique Entity Identifier, if I'm not mistaken, which is not an LEI.
That's great. Yeah. And the federal government generally has a number of different LEIs, legal entity identifiers, that they use. And so just so everyone knows, I think SAM is it GSA?
Believe
They're
so.
not included in the FDTA legislation. So this legislation does not completely harmonize legal entity identifiers across the entire federal government, which would be nice, but it is not.
But Cam, I think that's where it's important that, meaning and definition is done properly, right? So like Pete mentioned before, all the agencies can keep using their IDs and everything. But if you look at the use case that LEI is meant for, which is for identifying a legal entity, where they have an overlap use case that their ID matches for that use case, a legal entity usage, that's where the connection should be made. And that's how you create interoperability, right? So I think it's important regulators don't look at things as only use this. They should allow choice pertaining to the market needs and market use cases and work with the market. I mean, the public-private conversations that we've had over the past 5 years, actually since 2008, have been fantastic. I think it's led to a greater sense of understanding and learning. I mean, webinars like this that XBRL and the conversations XBRL is facilitating has done that, but there's still a wide level of learning that needs to be made. And that's just natural, right? So we're subject matter experts in our field, and our field is very narrow in a lot of cases. A back office operations person typically doesn't know what a front office person is doing, right? So understanding those use cases and being able to talk together, and especially from a regulator, looking at all the different functions in financial services, there's no way they can understand everything. It'd be too much to expect them to. So having these conversations, I think, help understand what the use case is, what identification's available there for to solve that use case, and how it actually ties into other identification or context or use cases that attach but aren't necessarily for that particular purpose.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add, Campbell, that prior to the FDTA was something referred to as the Evidence Act. And the Evidence Act had a key component of data sharing, right? And data sharing also set forth the formation of a Chief Data Officer Council. So this is a broader scope beyond the FSOC agencies. This is all federal agencies, right? So if the FDTA is successful, hopefully this is the new standard or sets the stage for other agencies to consider doing similar legislation that would lead to true information sharing using a linchpin identifier like the LEI.
Right. So just talking about that in these different use cases and different regulators, maybe Peter, you could wrap up on talking a little bit about some of the challenges for searching things like the EMA system, which is currently used, which is managed by the MSRB, which is, if you're not familiar with what EMA is, this is where all financial data for municipal securities is filed. Maybe you could give just some.
Yeah, I know Scott has commented on EMA, so maybe I'll just take a slightly different tact and say that, other than the challenges, I would rather focus on the opportunities, right? Because, by and large, the conclusion here is if it is the LEI, the conclusion would be this is for different entities reporting to all of these agencies, right? They would all use a common identifier scheme. So that effectively is the first step. So that typically is, the company that is filing with the SEC, that is registered with the SEC, or that has instruments that need to be filed with the SEC, or 40 Act mutual funds that are filed with the SEC, so on and so forth, right? So I think that sets forth a good example, but there are many other parties to financial transactions. And this is where we've had the conversation with the SEC, MSRB, and OMS, as well as other associations representing the muni market is, can we do things like identifying obligors, right? Because when you look at other parties to financial transactions, in particular ones that are included in financial documentation that's filed with the SEC, MSRB, and others like that, is there an opportunity to go past just the filer, right? Can we look at obligors and other other parties could also receive a legal entity identifier or LEI or equivalent identifier.
Right.
And I know we're almost out of time, so I just want to attach to Pete's excellent point and just indicate, both operationally and, for many years, we worked very closely with MSRB, and they have asked us over the last 5 years to make the appearance of an obligor for a municipal bond more obvious. We do supply that. It's an additional field. It's not something that we added an additional fee for. So we should have an offline conversation about this because we recognize the importance of obligors. There could be a Denver airport revenue bond, and it's not obvious who's on the hook for repayment of principal and interest when it's United Airlines. And so that's key data that we do supply, and making it more transparent, is in all of our interests. So thank you for raising that.
All right, so we're right at the top of time. I'd like to thank each of our speakers, Richard and Peter and Scott. That was very, very, very insightful. We didn't get to all of the questions, but thank you for people who were putting questions in. We appreciate that. And I think, Michelle, maybe you can just give some background just on if people wanted to see a playback of this, you could provide that information. So thanks again to all the speakers.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Campbell, Peter, Rich, Scott, really appreciate it. And we will have the playback available in the next couple of days. I know that a lot of the people that registered weren't able to come today, but I'm sure they'll be listening to it later on. I also want to mention that we want to give everybody a heads up that we will be holding another conference this summer. It's going to be July 29th and 30th in New York City. And the focus of that conference will be on the FDTA and more specifically on the municipal portion of the FDTA. So hope to see you all there. I think we'll have some lively and interesting conversations during that to kind of suss out how challenging it's going to be for issuers and for other stakeholders. So thank you again. And we'll be posting that and sending emails out to everybody the next day or two.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Campbell.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks.